Welcome to Your Deep Dive. Today, we're going to be looking at something that I think is going to be especially insightful, especially for those of you out there who are leaders. Have you ever noticed how some people just kind of like curse confidence? You know what I mean? Even when maybe their skills aren't like top-notch.
It's so interesting because I think we often equate those two things almost automatically, right? You see someone who's confident and you're like, oh, they must know what they're doing.
Totally, yeah. So tell me more about this study that we're diving into today.
So the study that we're going to be looking at came out in 2025. It's called Confidence Does Not Equal Competence. Socially dominant individuals are more confident in their decisions without being more accurate. And it was published in the journal Personality and Individual Differences. It looks specifically at this connection between personality, confidence, and competence, and really focusing on folks who display social dominance.
Okay, and before we go any further, can you just quickly define social dominance? I think that would be helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. So social dominance in this context refers to individuals who really kind of assert themselves and aim for power in social settings. They're often using strategies like intimidation or assertiveness. So think of like the folks who naturally take charge in like a group project or, always seem to be kind of steering the conversation in a meeting.
Gotcha. So it's not just being outgoing, it's more like actively striving for that power and influence within a group.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's important to note that there's another path to influence, which is referred to as prestige.
Okay.
And that's where someone like earns respect through their knowledge, skills, or achievements, and they become influential because people like admire and look up to them, not because they're trying to dominate.
Right.
But yeah, this particular study really zeroed in on the dominance side of things.
So did they look into why socially dominant individuals are often kind of perceived as competent, even if they might not be? Is that part of what they're looking into?
Yeah, that was one of their core questions. Is confidence kind of the secret ingredient that makes us perceive these individuals as more competent than they might actually be? And to explore this, they actually conducted 3 separate studies.
Tell me about those.
So the first study, they involved a statistical learning task with 143 undergraduate students. And this task helped them measure not only like how quickly and accurately participants made decisions, but also, and this is key, how confident they felt about their choices.
Oh, interesting. So it wasn't just about like getting it right. It was like, even if they were wrong, like how sure of themselves did they seem?
Exactly.
Fascinating. What about the other 2 studies?
So the second study looked at, they wanted to see if this confidence link also extended to memory. So they used a self-referential memory task with 150 students. And in this one, participants had to try to remember adjectives connected to themselves, a friend, and get this, Boris Johnson.
Boris Johnson.
Who happened to be the British Prime Minister at the time.
Wow. Okay, that's quite a reference point. What was the third study?
For the third study, they wanted to broaden their scope and see if these findings held up beyond just a student population. So they replicated the first study, but this time with 140 adults. They had an even gender split, and they were recruited online.
Right, yeah, casting a wider net to see if the same patterns emerged.
Exactly.
Okay, so they had these 3 studies, a lot of data to sift through. What did they actually learn? Did they find that these socially dominant people really were more competent, or was it like all an illusion?
Well, here's where it gets pretty interesting. Across all 3 of these studies, those who displayed social dominance consistently showed higher levels of confidence in their decisions. And, get this, regardless of whether or not those choices were actually correct.
Oh, wow. So it's like they project this aura of certainty even when they're like making bad calls. Does that sound right?
Yeah, absolutely. Did they find any connection to faster decision making? Like, are socially dominant people also just like quicker at making those decisions?
So previous research had actually suggested that yes, there might be a link between social dominance and quicker decision making. But this study actually found that it was more nuanced than that. It wasn't just about speed. It was specifically about the confidence they displayed, whether or not their decision making was faster.
So it's less about them being snap decision makers and more about projecting authority when they make those decisions.
It seems that way. That's a good way to put it.
So does that mean anyone who makes a quick decision is more socially dominant?
Well, it's not quite that simple. The study actually found that extroverted individuals also tended to show higher decision confidence. However, both social dominance and extroversion seem to independently boost confidence, suggesting that they're distinct but maybe interconnected factors at play.
So it's not a one-to-one thing. It could be extroversion, it could be this drive for social dominance, or some combination of both.
Right.
Okay. So I'm curious, what about those memory tests? Did they find a similar link there?
Well, that's where things get even more interesting. It seems this confidence boost is actually very task-specific. while it was evident in those decision-making tasks, when it came to the memory tasks, social dominance didn't seem to translate into any greater confidence.
So it's not like a universal confidence boost. It seems to be something they like apply very strategically, almost like a tool in certain situations.
Yeah. It really makes you think twice about those, like, quote-unquote, super confident types,
Yeah,
It's not as simple as it seems.
definitely. And here's the kicker. Across all three of those studies, they found that being socially dominant or extroverted didn't actually make people any more accurate in their decision-making or in those memory tasks.
Wow, that's huge.
Right.
Like, it really just drives home that point,
Yeah.
that confidence does not equal competence, especially for those who are socially dominant.
Yeah. And I think this has like some pretty significant implications for how we approach leadership and decision-making.
Yeah, totally. I can already see how this is making me rethink how I view potential leaders, like how I try to foster teamwork and collaboration. But before we jump into all of that, those practical applications, let's just take a moment to let this all sink in. This is pretty big stuff.
I agree. One of the things that I found so interesting about this research is how confidence can function almost like a type of social currency, especially for those folks who really are like kind of naturally drawn to social dominance.
So it's like a shortcut to gaining influence, right? Instead of having to prove their competence through actions, results, it's just like, oh, they're confident, they must know what they're talking about, kind of thing.
Exactly. And and it might not even be a conscious manipulation. It could just be like an unconscious tendency for those who are like wired for social dominance to project that air of certainty.
Yeah, right.
And that in turn kind of shapes how others perceive them.
That makes a lot of sense, but wouldn't that be a double-edged sword?
Uh-huh.
Like, it might help them rise quickly, but it could also lead to like a pretty hard fall if their skills don't actually like match up to that perceived competence.
Right. Absolutely. And that's why critical evaluation is just so crucial here. We need to learn to kind of separate genuine competence from just like a good show.
Totally. So how can we get better at recognizing that difference? What are some red flags that might signal that someone's confidence is more about personality than actual skill?
Yeah, I mean, that's the million-dollar question, right?
Yeah.
I think one telltale sign is a lack of concrete evidence to support their claims. Someone who's truly competent can usually back up that confidence with a track record of success, data, tangible results. If it's all talk and no action, that's a pretty good sign that their confidence might be a little inflated.
Yeah. Actions speak louder than words. But what about in situations where it's harder to measure competence objectively? Let's say, like, you're in a brainstorming session where creativity and ideas are key. How do you avoid being overly influenced by someone's dominant personality in a setting like that?
I think that's where fostering a culture of psychological safety within a team becomes important. Everyone needs to feel comfortable sharing their ideas regardless of their personality or where they sit in the hierarchy. It's about creating that space where ideas can like flow freely and everyone feels heard and respected.
So it's like making sure the best ideas win, not just the loudest voice.
Exactly. Are there specific techniques that leaders can use to encourage that kind of open dialogue? Like, how do you actually put that into practice?
Yeah, I think one effective approach is for leaders to really actively seek input from everyone on the team, even those who might be more introverted or a little hesitant to speak up.
Okay.
Something as simple as like going around the table saying like, hey, I want to hear from everyone on this can make a huge difference.
Yeah, it's a simple but powerful technique so that everyone gets their chance, even if they aren't naturally assertive or confident.
Yeah.
Are there other ways to kind of like level the playing field, encourage that like balanced participation?
Yeah. I think another good strategy is to encourage constructive debate, right? Like a healthy dose of dissent. Instead of just accepting the first idea that's presented, like as a leader, you could say, what are some alternative approaches we could consider? And that can really help bring a wider range of perspectives to the surface and potentially lead to more well-rounded decisions.
Right. So it's okay to challenge those assumptions, explore different viewpoints, even if it means disagreeing with the most confident person in the room.
Exactly. And I think it seems like there's a fine line that a good leader has to walk, right? Between encouraging that participation, but then also maintaining some control over the discussion.
How do you balance that?
I think a key part of that is for leaders to model humility, acknowledge their own limitations. If a leader's willing to say, hey, I don't know, or I'm not sure, or let me get your input on this, it creates a much more collaborative and less hierarchical environment.
Oh, that's such a great point.
Right. Leaders who are willing to be vulnerable and admit they're not always right, it actually, I think builds more trust. It encourages others to do the same. And it creates a much healthier dynamic than always trying to project this image of being all-knowing and confident.
It seems like authenticity and vulnerability are so crucial for creating that psychological safety that we were talking about earlier.
Totally, totally. And ultimately, I think an environment like that leads to better decision-making and better outcomes for the entire team or organization.
But it seems like there's a bit of a paradox here. We're talking about potential downsides of confidence, but isn't confidence also an essential ingredient for leadership success? How do you reconcile those two seemingly conflicting ideas?
That's a really good point. Confidence is definitely important for leaders. It gives them the courage to make those tough decisions, to take those risks, to inspire others to follow them. But I think, like most things in life, it's about finding the right balance.
Okay, so it's not about being blindly confident or projecting this image of infallibility.
Right.
It's more about having like a healthy sense of self-assurance, but it's grounded in reality, backed up by genuine competence. There needs to be substance behind that confidence.
Yeah. And that's where self-awareness becomes such a critical skill, I think, for leaders. They need to honestly assess their own strengths and weaknesses and adapt their leadership style accordingly.
Yeah. Someone who is naturally very confident might need to consciously dial back their assertiveness, create more space for others to contribute.
That takes a high level of emotional intelligence to be able to read the room, understand how your behavior is impacting others, and adjust as needed. It's not just about being in charge. It's about understanding the dynamics of the group.
You're spot on. And like any skill, it's something that can be developed through practice and self-reflection. Effective leadership, it's not just about like personality traits. It's about actively cultivating a leadership style that balances confidence and humility.
Yeah, and I think these findings from this research can be incredibly valuable in that process. By understanding the potential pitfalls of automatically equating confidence with competence, we can make more informed decisions about who we choose to lead, how we participate in group settings. It takes conscious effort to look beyond that initial impression of confidence and really assess whether or not it's justified.
We should never like blindly follow the most confident person in the room. You need to be like thinking critically, evaluating the evidence, seeking out diverse perspectives to really make the best decisions possible.
Yeah. Yeah, and that applies to not just formal leadership positions, but really anyone who's participating in group decision-making. We all have a responsibility to be aware of these dynamics, to make sure that everyone's voice is being heard.
This has been such a fascinating discussion. This research sheds light on the complex interplay between personality, confidence, and competence.
It's definitely given me a lot to think about. It's almost like peeling back a layer, see what's really going on beneath the surface. It's about moving beyond superficial judgments and really digging deeper, right? Understanding the true capabilities of the people around us. Recognizing that confidence, while it's a powerful trait, isn't always a reliable indicator of true competence.
Well said. I think we've covered a lot of ground here. We've explored those research findings, talked about their implications for leadership and team dynamics. We've touched on some practical strategies for dealing with those potential downsides of overconfidence.
We've given our listener quite a bit to think about. But before we wrap things up, I want to circle back to one of the key points from the research. This idea that confidence advantage seems to be specific to decision-making. You know, it didn't really show up in those memory tasks.
And that raises a really interesting question. Why is confidence so closely tied to our decisions, but not necessarily to other cognitive processes like memory? Like, what makes decisions different?
That is a great question. I'm curious to hear what you think about that.
Well, I think it might have something to do with just the very nature of decisions. When we make a decision, we're essentially choosing one path over another. Often that involves uncertainty, risk. It's about committing to a course of action, even if we don't have all the information, or even if there's a chance that we might be wrong.
So maybe confidence is like a buffer against that uncertainty. It gives us that courage to take action, even if there's a possibility of making a mistake. It's like confidence helps us overcome that natural hesitation we feel when we're faced with the unknown.
Exactly. That's where social dominance may come into play. Individuals who are naturally more dominant might be more comfortable with that uncertainty, that risk. They might even like thrive in those fast-paced, high-pressure situations where they need to make quick decisions with limited information.
So they're more likely to trust their gut instinct and just like act, even if it means potentially making a mistake.
Right.
Whereas someone less dominant might be more hesitant, more cautious, kind of second-guessing themselves, and then maybe they miss out on opportunities.
Right. Yeah, and that could explain why we often see socially dominant individuals rising to leadership positions, especially in fields that require quick thinking, decisive action.
Okay.
So think about, like business, politics, even like emergency response situations
Yeah.
where rapid decision making is crucial.
Makes you wonder if that tendency, right, to be more confident in decision-making, even in the face of uncertainty, might be an evolutionary advantage. For those who are wired for social dominance, it's fascinating to think about how these personality traits might be linked to our survival instincts, right?
Right.
And how we navigate, all these complexities of social hierarchies.
Definitely a possibility that deserves further investigation and exploration. It really highlights how complex and nuanced this whole area of personality, confidence, and competence really is.
Yeah, there's so much we still don't know. We've only just scratched the surface here, haven't we?
Yeah, absolutely.
We've talked a lot about the potential downsides of confidence, but what about the flip side? What are the potential dangers of a lack of confidence, especially for those in leadership roles?
Yeah, a lack of confidence in a leadership role can be just as detrimental as overconfidence. It can lead to indecision, missed opportunities, a failure to inspire and motivate others. A leader who lacks that confidence might hesitate to make the tough calls, delegate effectively, or champion bold new ideas, and ultimately that can kind of hinder the team's progress.
Right. It's like that saying, he who hesitates is lost.
Right.
But on the other hand, we've also seen how too much confidence can create problems. So how can leaders strike that sweet spot of healthy confidence, especially when they're faced with really complex decisions where there's no clear-cut right or wrong answer?
Yeah, I think that's where taking a data-driven approach can be so valuable, right? By grounding decisions in solid evidence, objective information, that can really help leaders, minimize the influence of personal biases, emotional factors. It helps to create a more rational and logical framework for decision-making, even when the stakes are high.
So it's about taking the emotion out of the equation as much as possible.
To a certain extent, yes. But I also think it's important to acknowledge that we can't completely eliminate emotion from decision making.
Right.
I mean, we're human beings, we're not robots. Emotions play an important role in our intuition, in our gut feelings, and those can be valuable assets in certain situations.
Right. And sometimes our instincts can guide us in ways that pure logic can't.
Right.
It's about knowing when to trust your gut and when to rely on data and analysis.
Exactly. I think the key is to strike a balance.
Okay.
Use data and logic as that solid foundation, but also acknowledge the role of intuition, of experience. A good leader knows when to lean on each of those tools, depending on the context of the decision.
It's about being aware of your own biases, both conscious and unconscious, and actively seeking out diverse perspectives to challenge those biases. It's about recognizing that you don't have all the answers and being open to input from others.
And that's where having a strong and diverse team can be crucial. By surrounding yourself with people who have, different strengths, different weaknesses, different viewpoints, you can really create a more balanced and well-rounded decision-making process. It's about leveraging the collective wisdom of the group rather than just relying solely on your own perspective.
That makes me think back to the research we were discussing earlier about socially dominant individuals and how they might potentially stifle input from others. So it seems really important for a good leader to create an environment where everyone feels comfortable sharing their thoughts, their ideas, even if they disagree with the leader.
Absolutely. A truly effective leader is not threatened by dissent or alternative viewpoints. They welcome it as an opportunity to learn, to grow. They recognize that different perspectives can really enrich that decision-making process and lead to better outcomes.
So it's about cultivating that culture of psychological safety where people feel empowered to speak up without fear of judgment or retribution. It's about creating that space where honest and open communication is valued and encouraged.
Exactly. And that takes conscious effort and skill. It requires leaders to actively foster that kind of environment through their words and actions.
Are there any specific techniques that leaders can use to create that kind of atmosphere, that psychological safety?
Yeah, I mean, I think one simple but incredibly effective strategy is to practice active listening. And I don't just mean hearing the words that people are saying, but truly trying to understand their perspective, where they're coming from. It's about showing genuine interest and empathy.
Active listening is such an important skill, but but I think it's often overlooked. We're all so busy thinking about what we're going to say next that we don't really take the time to truly listen to what others are saying.
It's definitely something that can be learned, can be practiced. It involves paying attention to both the verbal and nonverbal cues, asking clarifying questions,
Yeah.
reflecting back what you've heard to ensure understanding. It's about making the other person feel seen and heard.
It sounds like so simple, but it takes real discipline, right?
Yeah.
Intentionality to truly listen deeply, especially when you're in a leadership position. There are so many demands on your time and attention.
It does, but the payoff is immense.
Yeah.
When people feel heard, when they feel understood, they're much more likely to trust, to respect the leader, and they're much more willing to share their ideas, to contribute to the team's success.
Yeah. It creates that virtuous cycle, doesn't it? Where open communication leads to better decision-making, which leads to better outcomes, which then strengthens that trust, which then reinforces that open communication.
It's a win-win. It's a win-win for everyone involved.
And it all starts with the leader, setting the tone and creating that culture where those positive dynamics can flourish. So if we could distill all of this down into a few key takeaways for our listener today, what would they be?
I think the most important takeaway is that confidence is a really complex and multifaceted trait. It can be a really powerful asset for leaders, but it's not a guarantee of competence. It's important to remember that those two things, confidence and competence, are not always aligned.
And as leaders, we need to be discerning about how we perceive, about how we evaluate confidence, both in ourselves and in others. We can't just assume that someone who projects confidence is automatically competent. We have to dig deeper.
Look beyond the surface. Critically evaluate whether someone's confidence is really grounded in real knowledge, skills, and experience. What's their track record? What evidence supports their claims? These are all questions we should be asking.
And we need to be mindful of those potential downsides of overconfidence.
Right.
You know, like stifling dissent, creating an environment where people are afraid to speak up. A healthy dose of humility can go a long way.
Absolutely.
In creating a more balanced and effective leadership style.
On the other hand, we also need to be aware of the dangers of a lack of confidence, which can lead to, indecision, missed opportunities, a failure to inspire.
Right.
It's about finding that middle ground.
It's all about finding that sweet spot, that healthy balance, self-assurance and humility. That allows us to lead effectively while also fostering collaboration, open communication. And to our listener, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you've enjoyed the journey, and we encourage you to keep exploring these ideas. Keep questioning, keep learning. The most effective leaders are those who never stop growing.